Hey everyone, Clio here, and it's time to dive into my March wrap-up. Now, as always, I will have a couple of numbers on the screen all the time, so I will have the full amount on my physical TBR up there the entire video long. At the beginning of this month, this number was 84 books. The second number that I have there is the amount of credits that I have in my book buying credit system. At the beginning of the month, this number was 9 credits. And then I will have the amount of books that I read throughout the month. This number is all of the books, so it's not just the physical books, it is also audiobooks, ebooks, books that I borrowed or something like that. So any book that wasn't on my physical TBR still counts for that number. But so without further ado, let's just dive into it. I'm actually going to start with the books that I added to this TBR throughout the month. So there are 2 books that I added. First up, I added Klara in the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is one of my most anticipated reads for this year, and I'm so sad that I didn't find time for it in the month of March, but it's definitely going to happen. I definitely hope in the month of April I'm gonna be able to get some time in there for this book. So this is the newest release by Kazuo Ishiguro. It was released in this month at the beginning of the month of March, and it is going to be probably one of my most expensive books on my shelves because I didn't just pay the £20 that it cost to purchase this book, but I also paid more than 20 euros in terms of customs, what do you call it, customs charge. So yeah, it was a pretty expensive purchase, and it means that this is also the last time that I'm pre-ordering from the UK, sadly. But I am very excited about this book. It is also a signed copy. It is a Waterstones exclusive as well, so if it was going to happen with one book, this was the book for which I was willing to pay more, I guess. But this is a dystopian literary fiction piece of work. I have only read one other Kazuo Ishiguro, which is it a lie? No, it's not a lie. Which is Never Let Me Go, which is a dystopian literary fiction. So I think that I'm safe with this one, and I'm very much looking forward to diving into another Kazuo Ishiguro. But so this is all about artificial intelligence. I haven't dived into the plot too much, but I think it's a story told from the perspective of an AI, and that it's all about this AI seeking human connection while through her experience of interacting with humans, finding out that humans aren't necessarily all that trustworthy. For this book, I didn't have to use any of my book buying credits because this was a book that I pre-ordered before I even invented the whole idea of the book buying credit system. So this one gets a free pass, luckily, because that gave me enough credits to buy a second book, which is The Snow Leopards by Sylvain Tesson. I will have the English cover on top of it here. I'm not entirely sure about the English title for this one. If you're interested in this book, I will have it linked down below because this one I was struggling to buy it because it is very similar to another book by another French writer that also deals with snow leopards, and so I will have this exact copy linked down below in case you're interested. But so this is a book that is very popular in France at the moment, and so it's just been published in Dutch and it's making a splash here now as well. And so this is a book all about this French journalist who was given the opportunity to go out into the Himalayas, I think, in search of the snow leopards. He spent 3 months there, I think. And I think it's going to dive into some philosophical, spiritual reflections as well, because a lot of his time looking for a snow leopard will have been spent waiting. But there is another book written by a French journalist about the search for snow leopards, but that's a lot older. So if you're looking for this book, I have it in the link down below. However, this is a newly released Dutch book, which always means that the price is quite steep. So this book has cost me 21 euros, meaning I have to give up 7 credits for it. So reducing my credit to 2 for the months. So let's see if we can add on to that. So I'm going to be very brief in the first books that I'm mentioning here because I have finished those in the first half of the month, and so my thoughts on these are in my mid-month check-in, and so I will link that video up above, and if you want my full thoughts on these, then you can go over there and find out. But I will say I didn't finish a whole lot in the first half of the month, so there's not much that you will have missed, sadly. But so, first book that I finished this month is Skin by E.M. Reapy. This is a physical book off of my TBR, so that means that I get 1 credit for it. Next up is a book that I'm not going to talk about. This is a secret TBR book that I finished in the first half of the month, and it gives me 1 credit because, as you can see, it's a book on my physical TBR. Final book that I finished in the first half of the month is The Name of All Things by Jenn Lyons, which is not a physical read. I listened to the audiobook for this one, and so it does not earn me a credit. Final book that I'm just going to mention is one that I did finish in the second half of the month, but it's also a secret TBR book. So I finished a second secret TBR book. This book earns me a credit because it is a physical TBR book. But so let's dive into the books that I can talk about for the second half of the month. I'm going to try to keep this somewhat brief because I do have quite a lot of books to talk about here, and I don't want this video to last me forever neither. But so in order of when I finished them, I guess I need to talk first about The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. I'm not going to do a whole lot of talking about this one because it is a reread. So I absolutely adored my reread for The Final Empire. In The Final Empire, we are following this crew who are tackling the Final Empire. They want to bring down the Empire. They want to overthrow the Lord Ruler. One of the most fun elements about this story is its magic system. We have a magic system in which you can ingest metals in order to access magical powers, but throughout the series we will be exploring other magic systems as well within this world. I absolutely love this one, and I love the main character of Vin, for example. She's this sort of insecure girl as we meet her in the beginning because she has had a very difficult life. She has been beaten down by a lot of people in her past. She has been abandoned by a lot of people in her past, and so she does have severe trust issues. Throughout the series we will see her circumstances changing, and as a result she will be changing and will be coming into her own person. I love this series, love this reread, and I'm very eager to dive back into it, especially since I remember this one quite well, but the 2 books that are coming up now, I know snippets of it. I remember the huge sort of like big reveal at the end of the series, but I'm not entirely sure about a lot of other things that happen within it, so eager to dive back in and explore all of that. The second book that I finished was Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. This is a book that is earning me extra credit because this was on my list of 12 books to read in 2021. Now, this was a very interesting read, and it's diving into the subject matter of intelligence a whole lot. How much do we as a society value intelligence? How much merit do we put on people based on their intelligence? So our protagonist in this story, Charlie, is somebody who has a low IQ. And at the beginning of this story, he decides to enter into a study that is going to give him intelligence. And as he becomes more and more intelligent, he has to deal with these memories of the way in which his co-workers have been treating him, for example, and starting to see them in a new light. We get a first-person narration because Charlie is writing these progress reports in light of this study. And so we do see that rise in intelligence, first on a very superficial level in terms of a rise in grammatical correctness or in correct spelling, but we also see his sort of like more the way in which he's able to interpret things happening around him elevate. We also see him start using more elaborate vocabulary, for example. But there are definitely some very interesting emotional layers that this story dives into. First off, Charlie kind of splits into these 2 beings, while the change from original Charlie to intelligent Charlie happens gradually. At some point in the story you will definitely start to feel as if they are 2 different people, and past Charlie often seems to haunt present Charlie as well. Past Charlie is often there to keep him from certain interactions that are most likely tied in with traumatic experiences that Charlie has had in the past, for example. But also we dive into some complex subject matter when it deals with the way in which he is treated. A lot of people treat Charlie as if he has been created through the experiments, as if he didn't exist before that, just because he didn't have the level of intelligence that they consider to be the standard. And so the book is a very interesting read when it comes to those subject matters. I would definitely say be wary going into it because it is a hard read as well. Not all of the time, but there are definitely memories that Charlie starts to see in a different light as he becomes more and more intelligent. and that definitely are difficult to read because they deal with abuse that he had to deal with in his youth, as especially his mother was determined to have him be a normal boy. Next up, I finished I Have Lost My Wig by Gayle Forman, which is a YA contemporary. This is not my usual jam, and I will say that I enjoyed it. I think it did what it's trying to do great, and it was a good read, but it's also not one that's going to stick with me, or not one that I'll ever want to revisit, for example. So this is basically a story about these three teenagers who meet through chance, and they end up spending the day together, and throughout the day they are sticking together and tackling each other's problems, basically. And so I really love that sort of trope of strangers coming together and forming this huge bond. In the beginning I was kind of reluctant to really you know, get in line with the reason why they are sticking to one another, but I definitely think if you kind of suspend your disbelief there a little bit and kind of just accept the fact that this is how the story is unfolding, that in terms of the way in which this friendship is growing, I did definitely love it. Next book that I finished is a 5-star read and the best book that I've read so far this year, and that is Human Acts by Han Kang. So this is a South Korean novel, and it deals with the Gwangju uprising in South Korea in 1980. I had never heard of this event, and I would say that if you're going to dive into this one, I would read the sort of like introduction that is there at the beginning, because it kind of gives you the bare minimum of a background to these events and some information about the translation, but it's not like it's spoiling any of the story that is taking place. It is a multi-perspective book that will be diving into different perspectives throughout the uprising, but also in its aftermath, leading even as far away as maybe 30 years into the future, for example. This book definitely needs to come with a warning, because this was a very hard book to read. It was absolutely gruesome in parts. It was sickening in parts. It is very difficult to read. It makes you despair about humans and humanity and what humans can do to one another, and you will get that impression from the get-go. So I guess from the first chapter you will know whether this is too much for you or not, because the first chapter kind of starts with basically the sort of like central figure within this story, which is this boy who is looking for his friend, and he lost his friend during the uprising, and so in a little bit more of a sort of like quieter lull period during the uprising, he has found his way to this building where they are keeping the bodies of the fallen students, and so he is looking for his friend there. And that opening sequence will very vividly describe corpses, but it also will vividly describe preparation of courses for identification, for example. So there is already a lot of that darkness, a lot of that gruesomeness in that opening chapter. So that is already a good indication for you of whether or not you are able to deal with the way in which the story is told and with how intense this read is going to be, because we later on, for example, also have perspectives of people who were imprisoned during the uprising and who had to deal with torture for a long period of time in captivity, both males and females who have been in captivity and who have been tortured. But apart from actually looking at the uprising itself, the captivity of some students at that time, it also looks into the future. It looks at perspectives decades later who are trying to get some of these events out into print, and the way in which they have to deal with censorship, for example. So I thought it was a fascinating read, and at the very end we actually get the perspective of the author herself and why she is writing this book and the research that she did in order to write this book. I thought it was such a strong, impactful read. And it is also beautifully told. The writing style in this is amazing. I had read Han Kang's The Vegetarian, and I did not know what to think of it. It's been too long, but I think I liked the writing style, but it was just a little bit too weird for me, and I didn't really know whether it was good weird or bad weird. But this one is actually, in terms of its writing style, very accessible. It is at no point unclear to you what is happening. Maybe you sometimes wish it weren't as clear, but it is very crisp and clear, clean writing, but at the same time beautiful writing. And so I definitely am now convinced that I do want to dive into more Han Kang, and I would definitely say that it's a great read. It's just gonna be a very bleak one, so maybe not always the best one depending on your frame of mind at the time, but I just devoured it. I will say, for such a bleak and dark read, first of all it's quite short, so that's definitely a good thing, but for such a bleak dark read I was compelled to read it in one go. I could have done it. Next up, I finished The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nghi. This is a fantasy novella, and my main problem with it is that it was a novella, so I kind of felt like it was just a snippet of a story, like I wanted it to be more. And it's not even that it ends on a sort of like open-ended ending. I probably would have liked it more if it was a little bit more open-ended, because I don't know, then it would have felt more like this type of short story that I appreciate a lot of the times, whereas this just felt like a really short story that had a lot of potential to dive into some interesting subject matter, but that ended up being a little bit shallow on certain aspects of the story. So basically it's a story within a story, so I did like the oral narration style of it. We basically have these two characters who are investigating this place. I'm already vague on the detail. They're investigating this place, they're looking for items to take back to enrich the knowledge of this area of their sort of like religious tribe, I think. And the sort of like keeper of this place tells them the story of when she met the Empress of Salt and Fortune. And so her sort of like oral narration of that story I did definitely enjoy a whole lot. But so the story within the story, which is the central focus of this novella, kind of left me wanting more. It's very much about females being put in these sort of like symbolic places of power, but basically given zero power and basically deterred from taking any power as well. At some point within the story, the Empress of Salt and Fortune is kind of shipped off to the countryside so that she can be of no bother to anybody, and it's very much about her trying to reclaim power. But I would have liked to see those type of thematic explored in a longer format and really explore the way that that made that character feel, because it's also not told from her perspective. We also don't have that element to it, for example. So I will still continue and read the second novella within this series, but I did kind of feel like it was just a sort of like nice skeleton of a story rather than it being a fulfilling read for me. Next up, I finished Buffy the Vampire Slayer Volume 1. This is the modern comic version of Buffy. Buffy taken to a modern time period. I, as a big fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, did definitely love it. And so I will say, if you're kind of hesitant about this series potentially not handling the original series very well, I think it does a good job, because it takes some elements that were introduced later on within the story, it pushes them to the front of the story. Those are things that improve upon the story. So for example, Willow is already in a female-female relationship at the very beginning of this story, for example, rather than us waiting like, I don't know, 4 seasons for it to happen in the series itself. Cordelia, for example, is already given more depth in that first comic book already, rather than, I think in the series, at least during the first season, she's very much just a sort of like shallow prom queen type of character. And apart from it taking some of those elements that are dived into later in the series and pushing them to the front, to the beginning of the story already, it does stay very true to what is central and essential to the Buffy storyline. It does stay true to that sort of mix between battling demonic forces and battling teenage issues, battling things such as dealing with the anxiety of being a teenager, the anxiety of wanting to fit in, not feeling like you are being fit in, having difficulties, you know, being yourself around people, and all of those things. And so I really loved it a whole lot, and I'm eager to dive into the rest of this comic book series. Next up, we have one that I'm going to keep very brief, and that is We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer. I have a book talk out on this book. This is a non-fiction book dealing with climate change. Apart from dealing with some of the steps that we as individuals can take in order to help combat climate change, it also talks about the need for individual action and the way in which individual action isn't pointless. It's not going to win the whole battle, but we might not win the battle without individual action. And also it dives into why there is a discrepancy between understanding that there's a problem and being willing to tackle the problem. There's a huge section of this book that is also kind of sort of internal debate between the side of him that wants to take action and the side of him that is kind of pushing arguments his way in order to prevent him from taking action. That I think is definitely a nice section to read, because I think a lot of people will have these types of internal discussions that you have about those subject matters. You know, when you're saying like, let's stop eating meat, then there are definitely certain arguments that you will be pushing against yourself in order to prevent yourself from doing so. And so I think it's a very interesting book, and definitely a good one to start with, for example, as well, when it comes to non-fiction writing on climate change. It's also a very readable book. Jonathan Safran Foer is a fiction writer as well, and so this very much reads in a very narrative way as well. And then we end up with the final 2 books that I finished this month. I finished these books actually on the 1st of April, but I am counting them for March because I was going to finish them on the last day of March. But the last day of March was a gorgeous day here in Belgium, and I was invited by a friend to go have drinks in her garden. And I said, if the one reason why I'm not going to do that is just so that I can officially finish these books in the month of March, then that's not good enough a reason for me. So I decided that I was still going to count them for March if I finished them on the 1st of April. So the first 2 books that I'm going to talk about here are, first up, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. This is a difficult one because I was hoping to really love it, and I have friends who really like it a whole lot. It is a winner of a Pulitzer Prize. I did definitely appreciate a lot about this, but I did not like it, or I did not love it. I liked it, but like for me, that type of like in any case means 2 stars. So The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde is about Oscar Wilde. He is the sort of like central character to this story to some extent, as in we begin and end the story with him. So he is a boy of Dominican heritage who is living in the US. He is fat, he is black, he is a geek, he is not that charismatic, and he is very much struggling to connect. His family very much love him, but he is seeking connections outside of his family, and he is failing to get them. And so he also has suicidal thoughts throughout his book. He does attempt suicide as well. So suicide is definitely a triggering content for this book. But the story is not just told through Oscar's perspective. This story is told from various perspectives, from the people around him. It goes back different generations as well, and through this story we will be diving into a dark page in Dominican Republic history. We will be looking at the Trujillo period, so the period in which Trujillo was the president. And so this is very much a sort of like dictatorship in which any sort of criticism that was leveled against Trujillo would basically mean that you would end up disappearing, basically meaning you would be tortured and killed by the regime. What did I like about this story? I like that the sort of like magical realist element to it. So the story kind of started off with the idea that there's a curse on this family, and so the curse element will be reoccurring throughout. Multiple characters within this book will also see a sort of magical mongoose when they are at their sort of like bleakest moment, when they are about to potentially die. And I love that element to it. I loved the mixing of English and Spanish because of the Dominican heritage of these characters, and because of a big part of this book being set in the Dominican Republic, we have a lot of Spanish influences, and so there's a whole lot of mixing with English and Spanish, to the extent that I'm wondering whether I'm wondering what the experience is of an English reader who does not know any Spanish in reading this, because there's so much Spanish in there. So I cannot speak to that because I know Spanish. So for me that was just really fun to see Spanish incorporated so much, and to have that sort of real sense of Dominican culture, and that sort of sense of the intermixing of English and Spanish that's the result of diaspora. But I really enjoyed that part of it as well. I really enjoyed the section from the perspective of Lola, for example. But I will say that the big problem with this is that I didn't really care enough. A lot of this I was just reading, and I didn't really care about what would happen, or I didn't really engage with any of these characters. I don't think we necessarily also dive into the characters that much. It's not really a character-driven read in that sense of the word. I think it's mainly just trying to give an impression on the Dominican Republic, and the problem there was then that a lot of the factual information about the Dominican Republic or about the Trujillo era was given through footnotes, and while the footnotes are also told from the perspective of the narrator, they were a lot drier and a lot more just like bare factual information, and that would really slow down my readings. And while there's a huge amount of factual information in the beginning of the book, a huge amount of footnotes there, luckily we do get a lot less of those as the novel progresses. But yeah, there was just something missing for me. I read through it expecting that, you know, the ending, for example, would bring this all together and would shine such a light on this novel that it would have all been worth it. But for me, that actually ended up not being the case. The ending for me just made me kind of go, what was the point of me having struggled through it? And then finally, the final book that I read this month is The Rogue by Trudi, the second book in the Traitor Spy trilogy, which is the continuation series of the Black Magician trilogy. I have given the synopsis for this series so many times, but we are almost to the end of the series and then I can stop saying it every single time. But so, the Black Magician trilogy is a trilogy in which we are following Sonia, who is this young girl who is living on the street. She's living in the slums, and one day she discovers that she has magical powers. Problem is that in this world only the nobility were believed to possess magical powers, and so the series will definitely be diving into social commentary, into class struggles, but there's also a bigger world conflict with another kingdom, for example. The second series continues on from the first one. It continues on like 20 years into the future after the first series, and in the first book I found myself struggling a little bit with the past perspectives. I liked the new perspective that was introduced, but the perspectives of some characters that we had been following in the original trilogy, I was kind of left indifferent to some extent to them. It wasn't like it was a difficult read for me to go through or something like that. I finished it in 5 days. It's definitely a fast-paced read for me, but I wasn't fully engaged with those storylines. But that definitely changed in The Rogue. I loved all the storylines within this story. I will actually say that I was probably now most intrigued by the other storylines and not by the storyline that I'd grown to love most within the first book within the series, which is not to say that I was no longer interested. It's just that, you know, some of those other storylines suddenly became more interesting to me. We also have a new storyline that is introduced in this one, and that character I instantly fell in love with, and I'm so glad with the way in which that storyline went. I will say that I think a lot, as was the case with the first book, I don't know whether this is just me, and I don't think it is just me, but I knew what had happened from the beginning, not from the beginning, but early on I knew kind of what the deal was with a storyline in the first book and a storyline here in the second book, but that didn't dampen my appreciation of this book or my enjoyment of this book. It's just kind of making me wonder, like, was that the intention for me to like be left wondering about that? Because somewhat at the end it sometimes feels like there's no sort of like big reveal at the end or a big showdown in the end of these books, which could just be the way that these books are written. I don't miss them. It's just that I'm kind of gotten used to that sort of rising structure within a book because of Brandon Sanderson, for example, and that's definitely not the case here. I would also say that world building is not something that we dive into a lot with these books. And so also here, for example, there is a new magic that we are exploring, and we will get like zero information on how, or not zero, but like very limited information on how that works. So if you're used to a Brandon Sanderson style of fantasy, for example, this is going to be very different. And so maybe I just was drawing too much of a comparison with that because I had just finished The Final Empire, and because that was like the last fantasy that I had read before this one, and like most of the fantasy that I'm reading recently has that sort of crescendo effect, and this one doesn't have that. But regardless, I did definitely love it, and I did definitely immediately want to dive into the next one, and I love the way in which stories unfold in this one and the setup towards the new book. So yeah, that was the final book that I finished this month. Hey guys, I forgot to talk about one book that I DNF'd this month, and that is I Am a Cat by Soseki Natsume. This is actually a book that poses somewhat of a dilemma. So I unhauled it because this is the second time that I attempted to read it. I tried it like, I don't know, 6 years ago or something like that now. I read it physically then, and then I just put it down. I said like, okay, I'm not in the mood for this now, but it is a Japanese book about a cat, so I assumed that it was just my mood what that made me not really engaged with this book, and that if I tried it again at another point in life, that it would be a better read. But so I attempted it now again. I used the audio and the physical, and I'm not interested because we're not really following the cats. The cat is just kind of our lens at which we are looking at the humans in its life, and in which we are giving commentary on human society and the way in which Japanese society was at that time. But I couldn't focus. I couldn't really keep my attention to what was happening there. And I've read a few reviews. Like, it seemed like either people were loving it from the beginning or people didn't. And the presence of the cat actually diminishes over time, apparently. And then I also read a review of somebody who was saying that they really liked Saseki Natsume's writing, but that they didn't like this one. And so that apparently Saseki Natsume has a lot shorter novels that are way better, and so I'll be trying out some of those. But my dilemma with this one is that it was on my 12 books for 2021 list. So I actually get 3 credits for this one, but I DNF'd it. But I'm going to say that I get my 3 credits for it because I did attempt it. I did tackle it in 2021. It's just that I didn't end up sticking through with it because I didn't think it was my type of book. But I still tackled it. I still got it off my TBR this month. So I'm giving myself 3 credits for it. You can say that that's a little bit of cheat, but I make the rules here. So I'm deciding 3 credits go into my credit system because of this book. And so that means that this is a new number on my TBR. I now have 72 books left on my physical TBR, and I was able to reduce it by 8 during this month, which is great because I reduced it by 0 last month. And so with this huge reduction this month, I was able to catch up to what I should have also accomplished in the month of February. So really happy with that progress, really happy with seeing my TBR dwindle so much, hoping to be able to continue decreasing that TBR, continue chipping away at it throughout the months, and hopefully reaching that 0 TBR at some point. But so yeah, that was it for this month's wrap up. I don't know how long this is. I've had to reset the camera so many times, but I hope I was able to edit it down to a manageable length. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you've read any of these books, definitely let me know and we can chat about them in the comments down below. But so yeah guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this one and see you guys for a future video. Bye!